Hello everyone, I am back again. I have been absent from making videos for a while, and the primary reason is that I've studied the philosophy of religion and I wasn't able to contribute to anything new. So I wasted a few months of learning and decided to do something easier than metaphysics. Then I became vegan because I was inspired by the cosmic skeptic, and I still did not have anything new to contribute to any subject. After this, I decided to study ethics and the philosophy of art. This is actually a lot more enjoyable too, and by the way, many philosophers do not seem to be interested in the philosophy of art. There's actually many potential for the philosophy of art to progress with all the scientific research in uh, neuro neuroscience and that kind of stuff. But in this video, I'm going to discuss ethics first. Now, you may be somewhat familiar with my ethics. I have been debunking antinatalism like David Benatar's asymmetry argument, and I've also critiqued Inspiring Philosophy's video on meta-ethics. But to go back to antinatalism for a second, if you have watched my videos on David Benatar's argument, you may think I don't like antinatalism. But if you look into my objections, I never disagreed with the point of antinatalism. All I really wanted to do was point out that the words like good and bad are being equivocated. This refutation can be applied to many ethical theories. The thing is that the moral aspect of the asymmetry exists on these axiological values. I think David Benatar made some great points. So I actually agree that it would be worse for someone to be born. I only think that the moral aspect of the argument just has to be redone and reconsidered. If you're familiar with my critique on axiology, you might see how many ethical theories are being refuted. That's because there is a common misunderstanding among some philosophers. But one last point though, this video is not about the asymmetry argument. This video, as you can tell from the title, is about ethics. Analyzing the asymmetry will help us springboard into meta-ethics. Because when I started analyzing the asymmetry argument, at that same time I was establishing my theory of ethics. But this video is not about ethics actually. But do not get mad. The title of this video is kind of misleading, and I did this on purpose to try and grab your attention. Not as if I believe this video is going to reach thousands of views or something, but a more suitable title would be Decision Making for Everyone. Before we start, I want to point out a few things. First, I'm a hobbyist philosopher, not a university student. Many universities teach their students to think very systematically about philosophy, but I have the freedom to think about this subject without a professor telling me what mistakes I'm making. I would just like to warn you that although my ethics to me seem pretty great, they may be very naive. Second, if you didn't know already, I have a speaking disorder and my native language is Dutch. Therefore my videos will remain hard to understand and hear, I think, but I will try to be as clear as possible. Third, this decision-making theory is still a work in progress. My initial plan was to complete this theory before I would post it on YouTube, but then you would have to wait a little longer because my school started again. Alright. After I made these videos about the asymmetry, I made my case clear, I hope, that the axiological asymmetry lacks explanation. If you're not familiar with these objections, you can keep watching this video because I will shortly resume my previous antinatalist videos. But what will be discussed in this video after that, you may ask? After this introduction, I shall first explain what counter-arguments I've been giving against the axiological asymmetry. Afterwards, I shall propose a new way of looking at meta-ethics. And via this new meta-ethical foundation, we can start understanding how we can apply this theory to some examples of ethics. Okay, in my first video on Christian antinatalism, I proposed an equivocation fallacy to Benatar's axiological asymmetry. And this axiological asymmetry basically assigns the values good and bad to the empirical asymmetry. Now let's say we take the word bark. This word can be applied within two different contexts. For example, the bark of a dog and the bark of a tree. Context here determines what is meant by bark. And what if we could do the same with terms like good or bad and ethical or moral, but nobody is aware of it? Therefore, any human being can easily commit to an equivocation fallacy. For example, this answer is good and this answer is bad. Vegetables are good for you, candy is bad for you. Rescuing cats from a tree is good, murdering is bad. Listening to music feels good, having a fight feels bad. Are you able to see the equivocations? Here are alternative terms correctly applied within their proper context. So, this answer is true and this answer is false. Vegetables are healthy for you and candy is unhealthy for you. Rescuing cats from a tree is virtuous and murdering is a vice. Listening to music feels pleasant and having a fight with someone feels unpleasant. In my second video on antinatalism, called Meditations on Benatar's Antinatalism, I kind of criticized the utility of intrinsic and instrumental goods or bads. This does not escape the equivocation fallacy, however. The terms intrinsic and instrumental actually proves my point, because these adjectives work as a context to determine the meaning behind good or bad. The problem with these axiological adjectives is that it is possible to get contradictions. I mean, a square circle or a liquid ice are a contradiction in terms. Benatar, in the Cosmic Skeptic podcast, explained that surgery on your teeth may be intrinsically bad, but the surgery is a means as to prevent a sore tooth. Hence, teeth surgery is instrumentally good. Again, the adjectives intrinsic and instrumental merely provide a context to the word that comes after it. It should be evident from these examples that intrinsic bad is a feeling of pain, and that instrumental goods are something like obligations. Therefore, instead of saying surgery is intrinsically bad but instrumentally good, we could say surgery is painful but an obligation. Based on these rules, we will be disequivocating the terms good and bad and see what works best. Pain being unpleasant and pleasure being pleasant are intrinsic values. Consider pain being pleasant. If pain is pleasant, then pain is not unpleasant, because pain wouldn't be pain anymore. Therefore, it follows that pain is unpleasant, or we get a contradiction in terms. Pain is intrinsically unpleasant. This means pain cannot be instrumentally pleasant. If pain is intrinsically unpleasant, and is instrumentally pleasant for some greater good, we end up with impossible objects. As you can see from this sort of schema I've put up, you see that good, when it means experience or is intrinsic, it means pleasure. Same counts for bad. When it's like an experience, it is pain. And when we talk about ethics or the instrumental values, it is ought or ought not. Thus we can derive the following results from our first conclusions. It is possible to note that pleasure has nothing to do with obligation. Eating ice cream might be pleasurable, but that doesn't mean we ought to eat it. And that is the next equivocation, but can also end up begging the question. People sometimes say that murder is immoral. Here is a hidden equivocation between vice and obligation. Not only this, no, psychopathy is known as a psychiatric disorder. That's what I mean with vice. Hence, not only can we notice an equivocation when we say murder is immoral, it begs the question because immorality and murder both presume vice. Likewise, when stated that rescuing a cat from a tree is moral, within this example there's an equivocation between virtue and obligation. The point I'm trying to make is that virtue is in no way correlated to obligations. Because this mistake is made so often, I shall for now on refer to this as the moral equivocation error. This is not something you can look up on the internet, though. This is something I made up uh, myself, so it is easier for me to refer to this specific mistake. Now my journey has briefly been resumed, and we can look more closely into the origins of the moral equivocation error. It's not just a mistake made among some philosophers. Certain biases can cause us to believe in the absoluteness of goods and bads. Here are a few possible causes. The first one is cognitive dissonance. This means that your reasons or needs are not consistent with what you expect. If a proud student fails his exam, then it might be inconsistent with his belief that he is intelligent. At this moment, he might rationalize that the people who made up the exam are biased. This is an ego defense mechanism called rationalization. This is also called the self-serving bias, in which case someone attributes his success to his dispositions, or to himself, and his failures to situational factors, or external causes. So the first explanation is that we blame faults by outside forces as an ego defense mechanism. A secondary possibility is the Zeigarnik effect. In the book Why God Won't Go Away, the author explains that humans have a tendency to anticipate and think about uncertain situations. I'm not going to delve too much on this right now, but he has a chapter dedicated to karma, and I think that is very fitting to this moral equivocation error. The Zeigarnik effect basically has it that people cannot deal with loose ends. A movie will try and keep you invested by keeping you confused and make you ask questions. This is the Zeigarnik effect. A third possibility is that it could originate from our belief that we as human beings, have moral responsibility. I will talk about free will and determinism in a few minutes. The belief that people deserve evils and rewards originates from a bias called the just world hypothesis. Here is how Wikipedia describes it. It is a little bit small, however. You might want to look it up if you will. It is the bias that all people, their actions are inclined to bring morally fair and fitting consequences to that person. Thus, it is the assumption that all noble actions are eventually rewarded and all evil actions are eventually punished. It is often associated with a variety of fundamental fallacies, especially in regard to rationalizing people's suffering on the grounds that they deserve it. I'm not an advocate of moral responsibility, though. If you want to learn more about this, then read this book, Against Moral Responsibility by Bruce N. Waller. But that doesn't mean that determinism, which basically abolishes moral responsibility, also inclines toward an abolishment of retribution. Let me provide an answer. In the Netherlands, our legal system speaks of four goals of retribution. This means that the following reasons can be used to justify the act of retribution. First one is retaliation, second, prevention, third, rehabilitation, and fourth, prevention of revenge. The latter one basically means that the victim involved in a crime who has suffered a loss might want to punish the criminal out of anger. And to prevent fights from happening, we set up jails. To simplify it even further, if you were to ask, why is this criminal in jail? The police could say, well, he's in jail, so others cannot hurt him. Now, the only type of reason in this list my moral equivocation error and moral responsibility abolitionism really exclude is the first one, retaliation. That's because the first one commits to the moral equivocation error and commits to the just world hypothesis. Nobody deserves to be punished when nobody can be morally responsible. What we could say is that jail time is effective for the remaining reasons in this list: prevention, rehabilitation, and prevention of revenge. But we will get into this later. Okay, my meta-ethics. What does the moral equivocation error tell us about meta-ethics? Now, let's first look up the definition of ethics. Moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. And what about the definition of moral? Concerned with the principles of right and wrong behavior. I really hope my moral equivocation error proves the ambiguity of right and wrong. And if this is what the definitions lead to, then I'm afraid I would need to subscribe to moral anti-realism. Because the moral equivocation error is a type of error, theory of morality. And this error theory can be used in some very interesting ways, by the way. For example, evangelicalism holds that the Bible is inerrant, also known as biblical inerrancy. Now, I have not really delved into biblical studies too much yet, because I'm not even through Genesis. So for those people who are interested, I shall use a random verse from the Bible and apply moral error theory to it to disprove biblical inerrancy. So here's an example. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Romans 12:9. From the context of this verse, we can conclude that good means virtue, but because cling is prescriptive. Therefore, the term good is not being equivocated. The real problem is that it doesn't give us moral knowledge. It is universally known, and it is pretty much common sense, that we should not murder, for example. That would be a vice, and there are reasons for avoiding this. Look, when you are confronted with a situation, you need to make a decision based on your reasons. But this Bible verse doesn't give you reasons to justify making a particular decision. We will get into this again shortly. To wrap up our topic surrounding the moral equivocation error, remember that error theory is only compatible with moral anti-realism. Now, do not get me wrong. When we dismiss moral realism and ethics as reliable, we are not dismissing decision making. One very popular notion among atheists is the hypothetical imperative. Okay, moral epistemology. I think the hypothetical imperative is an excellent method of thinking about our decisions. I would like to change one thing though. The hypothetical imperative lacks an epistemic aspect. Okay, if I want X, then I ought to do Y. I want to replace ought with options. And then in that case we get, if I want X, I have options A, B, or C. I would like to ignore the metaphysical fuss and nature of obligations, if you don't mind. I would just like to focus on how we gain knowledge and about options, how we gain knowledge about options and reasons for deciding which options to choose from. Okay, let's imagine you experienced 10 occasions in which you put cold chocolate milk in the microwave, and 9 out of 10 times it got you a cup of hot chocolate milk. But 1 out of 10 times the microwave exploded. Now, how much reason do you have to believe that putting cold chocolate milk in a microwave gets you hot chocolate milk? I'm keeping this simple, so if 9 out of 10 times the microwave got you hot chocolate milk, then the probability is 90%. Therefore, if you want hot chocolate milk, you have 90% reason to believe that putting it into the microwave gets you hot chocolate milk. What is so important about this is that decisions made by reasons are rational. When the microwaving option is justified by 90%, it would be rational to choose this option, and it would be irrational to pick another option if other options are ineffective. What is even better is that experience also makes you discover new options. The microwave option is just one example. You may also have experience with using a kettle to warm up milk and mix it with chocolate powder, giving you 2 options. These types of options are experiences retrieved from memory. We shall refer to this as memory retrieving options. Experience is also one particular type of knowledge. There's one branch in epistemology called social epistemology, entirely focused on testimony and knowledge gained by friends, authority, and people in general. Maybe we're going to discuss social epistemology in a separate video, but in this case we have 2 types of memory retrieving options: memory from experience and memory from testimony. Let's say your goal is to buy a sweater. You have no experience with shopping, however. You have 10 options of sweaters right in front of you. In this situation, you cannot use memory retrieving options to give you reasons for making one decision over another. Options are presented at you at the current moment. We shall refer to this as empirically discovering options. Events are something you experience, but these experiences cannot be causally abolished from reality if these experiences are empirical. Events do exist external to the mind, but claiming there are obligations outside in space-time which tell Bob he ought to eat when he is hungry would be absurd. According to the hypothetical imperative, Bob only ought to eat if he wants to survive, which is a personal and private obligation, but a logical one. There is one last thing to say about this. Let's say you are microwaving chocolate milk. Your friend walks up to you and asks, "What is the purpose of microwaving chocolate milk?" You respond, "The purpose of microwaving chocolate milk is to give myself hot chocolate milk." As you may notice, options must always have a purpose. This is important to remember. Now we have gone through meta-ethics, I think we are ready to place the last pieces of the puzzle. Now your question might be, what ethical theory is compatible with the hypothetical imperative? One ethical theory we can dismiss right away is deontology. Deontology is an ethical theory that uses objective rules to distinguish right from wrong, and it seems kind of difficult to me to apply this ethical theory with anti-realism. As for how I just proposed the definition of deontology, I think this theory ends up as incompatible. Look, if you think that stealing is bad because there is an objective moral rule which says so, people do not have reasons for choosing one option over another. Consider two options, with the purpose of making you gain pleasure. Option A, you steal money in order to gain pleasure. Or option B, you can be nice to others in order to gain pleasure. Contrary to decision-making theory, let's try and look at this from a deontologist's perspective. There are two objective moral rules lingering in the universe. You shall not steal, and you shall be nice to others. My question is, why? These moral rules lack reason. Which reasons do I have for choosing option A over, say, option B? And if you watch Rationality Rules, you may be familiar with his ethics. He, just like me, also uses the hypothetical imperative as a foundation for meta-ethics. But his theory does not really seem to go further than this. Rationality Rules seems to believe that morality is objective. And as far as I'm concerned, he does identify himself as a moral realist. If it is the case that he is a moral realist, I do think his ethical theory kind of leans towards deontology. But I digress from using deontology and moral realism. And it should be obvious when you hold onto the moral equivocation error and rational decision making. From now on, I will christen this problem as deontic dysfunction. It's that decisions lack reason. But what ethical theory does go together with the hypothetical imperative? What I would like to do now is to consider a few ethical theories and dismantle the definitions. First of all, we have utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory which says that an action is morally good whenever it achieves more happiness and less suffering. In order to figure out whether this ethical theory can be applied to the hypothetical imperative, we first need to reformulate this definition. As this is stated as a definition, we cannot really tell if this theory is either helpful or not. Thus, let's reformulate this as a moral principle. You ought to make decisions that achieves more happiness and reduces suffering. As an anti-realist, I cannot subscribe to vacuous universal laws. Just like I explained in my meta-ethics with the Bible verse, if you still remember, people need reasons which justify making a decision when faced with options. So let's analyze this statement. If you were to ask an utilitarian why we ought to make decisions that achieves more happiness, the utilitarian might respond with, well, because humans want to be as happy as possible. Now we do have a reason. We ought to maximize happiness because we want to be happy. This does sound like a hypothetical imperative. Now, I am not saying all utilitarians are like this. All I'm trying to achieve here is to make a distinction between utilitarians, whom are moral realists, and utilitarians, whom are moral anti-realists. Now, there are just a few remaining points to clarify here. The fact that most utilitarians assert that people ought to maximize their happiness does say something about happiness. And that is that people want to maximize it, which is actually false. Research shows that people feel more unhappy when they focus too much on maximizing pleasure. Because people end up regretting their decisions this way, this is called regret theory. I will give a definition of regret theory. Regret theory refers to human behavior regarding the fear of regret, which stems from people anticipating regret if they make the wrong choice. This fear can affect a person's rational behavior, impairing their ability to make decisions that would benefit them as opposed to those that would harm them. And if you would like to learn more about regret theory, one excellent book I read is The Paradox of Choice by Boris Schwartz. A great book on regret theory, by the way. I really recommend reading it. Now let me give you an example of how utilitarianism is false. Imagine yourself, if you will, running the Olympics and you end up second place. According to utilitarianism, you should feel better in comparison to the person who is third place, but worse in comparison with the person who is first place. Regret theory says otherwise. Because you just didn't make it to the first place, there is a near miss effect. This regret makes you feel worse than those who are first or third place. This author also clarifies the difference between maximizers and satisficers. Now, maximizers try to make the maximally greatest decisions, and satisficers might make decisions just good enough for them. Also very interesting is that satisficers are happier than maximizers. Maximizers are more prone to self-criticism, counterfactual thinking, and therefore regret. Here I just described my ethical theory, and there is a name for it. I call it, or it is called, satisficing consequentialism. It is the idea that agents are happy with making decisions with good enough consequences. Utilitarianism is different and has it that agents like to make decisions with the best possible consequences. But this doesn't fully answer what drives people. But is there even such a thing as a universal desire? This is important for the hypothetical imperative, of course. I read a few books on this, like Drive by Daniel H. Pink and Comparative Psychology by Daniel C. Martson. The first book defends a humanist type of psychology, which I do not really like, and the last book was pretty great in my opinion. It takes the behaviorist approach and compares animal psychology with human psychology, hence the name of the subject, comparative psychology. If you do not know what behaviorism or humanism mean, well, humanists call themselves free thinkers and believe people have free will, which explains Pink's belief that humans do not get more motivated by rewards and punishments, methods of conditioning. Behaviorism states just that. We can explain most of human learning and behavior by how we are conditioned. So, as you may notice, we have three different arguments which try to explain human motivation. Humanist psychology. People want freedom and be less conditioned by rewards and punishments meant to maximize human capacity. Behaviorism. People want to survive and learn similar to animals and can be conditioned like them. Regret theory. People tend to get more depressed with a maximizing mindset when given too many options. So it's not really done yet, the universal desire problem. So this problem still cries for explanation, and later on we will return to the subject and I shall explain more. This is the warning I gave you at the introduction as well. My decision-making theory is still a work in progress. But first, we haven't come up yet with a defense in favor of cognitivism. I mean, how can you disagree about someone's motivation? If someone is motivated by aggressiveness, then you couldn't say, well, I disagree. Here's how we solve it. Okay, now remember I am a moral non-cognitivist. I've said this before or made it clear in my video called a judgmental God, but generally I'm a cognitivist about decision making. Because according to my notion of how we gain knowledge, as we discussed previously, of course I'm a cognitivist about it. It would be odd for me to say that we cannot disagree or agree about the reasons upon which we make decisions. That is not a problem. The problem is whether or not we can be cognitivists about our needs. Suppose you want hot chocolate milk. Then you have 90% reason to justify the belief that placing cold chocolate milk in the microwave will get you hot chocolate milk. So we're gonna break it down. The want is hot chocolate milk. The options are placed in the microwave, use a stove, or use a kettle. The belief is the microwave will get me hot chocolate milk. And the justification for that belief is 9 out of 10 times microwaving chocolate milk got me hot chocolate milk. We can be cognitivists about our experiences and the purpose of these options. If I were to ask you, what is the purpose of what you're doing, you might answer with, well, the purpose of this is to get myself hot chocolate milk. This obviously is a belief we can be cognitivists about. I may respond, I disagree, this microwave is broken and doesn't warm up anymore. This is all great, but ultimately, my question is whether or not we can be cognitivists about our wants. At the face of it, we cannot be cognitivists about our wants. I cannot, for instance, disagree about your want for hot chocolate milk. That sounds nonsensical. Now let's take aggression as an example. You ask about Bob's aggressiveness. Bob, what is the purpose of your aggression? And Bob says, I feel threatened and I need comfort, if he's really open. You ask him a second question. What reason do you have to justify the belief that aggressiveness will get you comfort? Bob says, well, being aggressive always has given me comfort. I learned this from experience. You say, but aggressiveness will make you look hostile. Therefore, aggressiveness doesn't get you comfort, but creates enemies. The only way of being right is by arguing that this option, being aggressive, is irrational. There must be more reason for the belief that being friendly will get you more comfort. A book mentioned earlier holds the same idea. So this is a quote in chapter 4, page 101 from Comparative Psychology. So, quote, but what remains constant across species is that aggression serves a purpose. There is little benefit in therapy and counseling to focus on aggression being wrong rather than addressing aggressive behaviors as often being ineffective. End quote. So, in order to defend UPB, or universally preferable behavior, all undesirable behavior like murdering, lying, cheating, etc. must be ineffective. Therefore, in order to make a case for this, we need to look at why the purpose of undesirable behavior is ineffective. This endeavor is going to fail because aggression sometimes works as an instrument to condemn other types of aggression. So let's say that stealing money is ineffective because you will always get caught stealing. Stealing money is always ineffective. But consider a company abuses its powers for its own egocentric pleasures. In this case, the government taking money from this company would be necessary to prevent something like this from happening again. Therefore, whether or not stealing money is ineffective depends on context. The decision to demand money from the company is either rational or irrational. It would be rational if stealing money fulfills the government's purpose to prevent the company from abusing their power. Thus, UPP is impossible, because in order to systematically prevent any undesirable behavior, like abuse, you need to make a system of retribution. So consider a new example. You want to eat food and have two options. Option A, eat vegan food, and option B, eat meat. Now both options are equally rational for the purpose of you wanting to eat. If both options are equally rational, there is no reason to pick one over the other. Now what you should know is that if both options are equally rational, one out of these two options can be considered unnecessary. So option B is unnecessary because you always have option A left. But the same is true vice versa. You could say option B is a bad option and that option A is good. But that would be a commitment to the moral equivocation error. There are many reasons for going vegan, like global warming, health, pandemics, the costs of resources, but those are not the reasons we are looking for. My question is, if you want to eat, then can eating meat be ineffective in its purpose? One way of fixing this is by using standards. Let's say you want peace as a secondary desire besides eating. Now, this standard suddenly becomes a tool for making decisions. Eating meat has certain consequences, like killing animals, which is not peaceful. How do standards work? Imagine yourself buying jeans and have 5 options. One option can be more reasonable to believe in its purpose over another option's purpose. Now, all jeans besides option 5 are female jeans. You choose option 5 because you are a male and female jeans are not what you're looking for. The reason you choose 5 is because it is a jeans for males. This means you wanted more than just jeans. Reasons can therefore reveal hidden needs or standards. So let me explain. Imagine that your friend wants to watch a movie, but doesn't know which one. You tell him to watch Mr. Bean because this movie is hilarious. The fact that you try to convince your friend with the reason this movie is hilarious shows that you think he has a preference for comedy movies. From now on, I shall refer reasons as priority justifying to denote their utility, and preference when denoting them specifically. Now, not all reasons are priority justifying. My reasons for believing why 2 plus 2 equals 4 will be predicated on truth, not my preferences. I shall refer these as causal justification or just causes. The fact that Emily was running is the cause for her falling on the ground. But do certain facts cause us to have preferences? Does the fact that candy is sweet be the cause for some to have preferences for eating it? I think this type of empirical approach will not work. I am too much of a nativist to not believe that the taste of sweetness comes from outside of our brain. But that doesn't mean we have in but doesn't that mean we have inborn preferences? Where do preferences come from? Read Colin McGinn's book Inborn Knowledge if you would like to learn more about nativism, because I'm not going to give an explanation of nativism here. It might feel kind of weird to wrap up our topic here, but I need to figure this out further in order to finish my theory. There are a few interesting things we can think about. First one is biblical ethics. Again, some Christians might accept that deontology is predicated on this deontic dysfunction. Objective moral rules do not give us reasons for making decisions. What the theist could respond with is that objective moral rules have certain undesirable moral consequences, like if you commit murder, you shall end up in eternal damnation. In my opinion, this is totally fine, but in this way, all options of murder are abolished because people have an egocentric interest towards their own happiness. Stated differently, you restrain yourself from committing murder because you value happiness more. Let's say there is an objective moral rule which says that you should love God. In this case, people do not love God because they do, but because they want to go to heaven. What would be more brave in this situation is if people sacrifice their opportunity. If a person restrains from loving God and not committing murder, he sacrifices his opportunity to go to heaven. You could say that this person is not motivated by his egocentric interests. What you could say is that people are born with sin. That's one solution. In that case, people need to sacrifice their opportunity to do evil. That sounds kind of weird as well, because it means people are not interested in going to heaven. Now the question is, what does this mean philosophically, the decision-making theory? I think this decision-making theory sounds very similar to the ethics of Ayn Rand and humanist ethics. But I still have to make sure if that is true though. So if you're interested, you can look it up, and I will try to figure it out myself a little bit. It will be a subject for another time. And the one last point, objections. Are there any counter arguments against my decision-making theory? And the answer is I don't know. To be fair, I think coming up with a counter argument will end up in self-contradiction. My decision-making theory is really simple to understand. If you have reasons that justify a belief over an option, making that decision would be rational. Now, if say you do not like my theory and you give arguments X, Y, and Z, these arguments work as reasons to justify your belief. Therefore, according to the opponent, he made a rational decision. But that would be self-refuting because he's using the decision-making theory in order to refute the decision-making theory. I think the only two points you could possibly argue against are my moral equivocation error and the deontic dysfunction. Now the last point, gaps that need to be filled. As this theory is still a work in progress, I can recommend some books for further investigation. These are books I'm gonna read, because as you may notice, the main gaps are about desires, primarily. I've been looking at two books, The Psychology of Death by Robert Kostenbaum and The Biology of Desire by Mark Lewis. I hope these two books can answer my questions. If you have anything interesting to say, leave it in the comments below. And then for now, I will see you next time.